Okay, I think we should make a start. I want to, if you could, I just ask you all to mute yourselves. Thank you very much. I am really grateful to all of you for giving up your time today to talk about something that is very close to my heart as a journalist. That is the responsible reporting of domestic violence. This panel discussion is going to take the form of our panelists talking for a few minutes about their areas of expertise, and then it's going to move on to a kind of open conversation. We'd like to involve you, the audience, as well in that conversation. But firstly, I'd like to introduce myself, and my name's Hannah Storm. I am the director of the Ethical Journalism Network. I've also done a lot of work in the field of gender and media consultancy as well. I'm going to introduce our panelists now. And our panelists, we have Oisika Chakrabarti. She's the acting Chief of Communications and Advocacy at UN Women. She's currently based in New York and is a communications strategist with more than 2 decades of international experience in senior roles at the UN, broadcast and print journalism, and public advocacy for NGOs. Thank you, Oisika, for joining us. I know it's such a busy time for you at the moment with the 16 days, and you'll talk about that later. And thank you for coming on so early in the morning in New York.
No worries.
Next we've got Shyster Aziz. She's the head of media and communications at Solace Women's Aid, a journalist, writer, and national anti-racism and equalities campaigner. She's a proud intersectional feminist. As a former aid worker, she's worked across East and West Africa, Middle East and Pakistan, working with people displaced by conflict, natural disasters and insecurity. She works closely with women experiencing domestic abuse and homelessness across the UK and is a homeless rights campaigner. Welcome, Shaista. And then we have David Challen. David is a domestic abuse campaigner and keynote speaker. He successfully campaigned to free his mother, Sally Challen, in a landmark appeal, recognising the lifetime of coercive control she suffered. And that was in February 2019. David continues to speak out against violence against women, coercive control, and recognising women's experiences in the criminal justice system. David's a prison advice and care ambassador and a freedom programme ambassador. And welcome to those of you who are joining us. I'm Hannah Storm, the director of the Ethical Journalism Network. I'm just introducing our panellists. We are recording this, and I do hope that you will take part in this active conversation. When you have questions, please send them through to me on the chat system, and I will pass them out to the panelists towards the end. And last but not least, we have Janie Starling, and she is the co-director of the feminist campaigning organisation Level Up, which developed the UK's first media guidelines and trainings for reporting on fatal domestic abuse. And we will share that resource later. And I urge you, if you're not familiar with Janie and Level Up's work, to follow them, because she's doing some fantastic work in this space. Oisika, I'm going to move to you first of all, if that's okay, to give us a bit of the perspective in terms of the global picture. When we talk about the global picture in terms of domestic violence and why the media needs to get messaging right in that space, and also tell us a little bit about the 16 days of activism and what the UN is doing to support media globally at the moment.
Sure. Thank you so much, Hannah, for this invitation, and really looking forward to this conversation with so many experts and folks working in this area. And this is a really, really important conversation as we head into, the 25th November, which is the International Day to End Violence Against Women. But more importantly, I think what it does is it kicks off the 16 days of activism. And the 16 days of activism is not owned by the UN, it is owned by civil society. It was started in 1991 and by the Center for Women's Global Leadership here at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And, it's become an organizing strategy across the world where folks, and I'm from India myself, and, civil society, governments, nonprofits, they all work together to put a focus on gender-based violence, and they use the 16 days very, very well at the grassroots level. What we see this year is distinctly different, of course. I mean, violence against women is an area that UN Women and many other parts of the UN and others have worked for years. But what we saw during, as COVID hit, was this real upsurge in violence and reporting on violence that obviously, is so unprecedented that we call it like a shadow pandemic, a concurrent pandemic that is happening along with COVID. And the numbers were really, really alarming, no matter where they were coming from. We saw that, before the pandemic hit, just in the last year before the pandemic hit, there were 243 million women and girls who experienced sexual and physical violence from their partners. But with the pandemic, everything just got worse, whether it was domestic violence, whether it's cyberbullying, child marriages, sexual harassment on the streets, and all these reports started flooding in. And the reasons are sort of many, but one of them is that more and more women have been pushed into poverty across the world. And that is one of also a critical reason that we see in the global south, where the calls are rising. Just in the first few weeks of the pandemic, there was a 5-fold increase in women using helplines and getting calls into helplines. We also saw that in some countries the reporting went up to about 40% across the world. And for every 3 months that the lockdown continues, an additional 15 million women are expected to be affected by violence. And these are some of the projections that we are seeing. And it was such an upsurge that the Secretary General in April put out an appeal for peace at home. And we saw a lot of countries responding to it, but it's still not enough because the culture of impunity continues. Out of, I think, 206 countries that we analyzed in the measures that they have taken, only 48 have really treated violence against women and girls as integral part of their national and local COVID response. And of course, funding for these measures are also inadequate. I think, why is it important to raise this issue in the media? Because I think media can play such a critical role as opinion makers and shapers of what the regular folks read and think and how they react. And I think, as important as it is, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation of having a sort of survivor-centered approach to the reporting one does on domestic violence or on other forms of violence, so is it to talk about the ecosystem that actually allows such crimes to continue with impunity. And to look at it from a point of view of what can the services do, what can the police do, what can the response be from from the judiciary, what can the media do? So I think it's really important to see it as a part of that ecosystem. What can civil society do? One of the things that we have seen during the COVID response is so much of civil society funding has been slashed down, and civil society is at the front and center of the response that one provides for domestic violence. And we are really calling for that in 16 Days of Activism. The theme for 16 Days of Activism, which UN Women puts out this year, is Orange the World. And orange has been a color that has been used during 16 days for years now. But it's really Orange the World, fund, respond, prevent, and collect, which is really prevent gender-based violence, respond to survivors' needs, collect data, and to make sure that funding happens for essential services on gender-based violence and women's organizations.
Thank you, Oisika. Sorry.
No, go ahead. No, please. I can go on and on.
Sorry
Please.
to interrupt you. No, that's just, some of those statistics are just absolutely, I wanted to say astounding, but it's really, really saddening that these statistics are, this situation is the shadow pandemic you're talking about. And I think we'll unpack some of that more later on, because I know Janie for sure has been doing work with newsrooms as to how to support journalists to better report on this in the framework of the fact that this is about control, as Janie's often said, and not necessarily COVID. Shaista, I want to move on to you. We know that the media continues to minimise violence against women and girls, and there's a lack of focus on survivors and more on perpetrators. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on the work that you're doing at Solace Women's Aid, and also your perspective on how there's also an added dimension of misogyny and othering and racism that comes into play here.
Yeah, so hi, good afternoon everyone, and thanks for organising this panel, Hannah, and it's great to be here with everyone. So you've hit the nail on the head with the introduction there. So I've been working as a journalist for more than 15 years, 10 of which were spent working in newsrooms in the UK, primarily in the BBC newsroom as a news producer, but I've also freelanced for CNN internationally, and I've worked in newspaper offices. And in all the time that I was working there, I was never given any guidelines, issued with any kind of advice on how to interview a survivor of abuse, a survivor of violence. It was just automatically assumed that if you work as a news producer, you're assigned a story, and on that day your job is to go out, make sure you get that story, and get the story in the can, so to speak, and make sure it gets out on time. That was it. There was never any guidance issued at all. And so when I went off to work as an international aid worker, I was working primarily with women and children impacted by conflict and abuse, and the trauma there was very visible and very evident. And again, I was never really issued with any clear guidelines. So I'm there interviewing women who've been subjected to FGM, or who have, you know, I'm being sent out to go and cover a story about child mortality and pregnancy, and women are pulling me, literally, no exaggeration, into a cupboard to talk to me about how they've been raped and sexually violated by soldiers, by armed actors. And in many instances, the reasons why these women were talking to me was because I, in their eyes, looked like them. They felt that I was not a white woman in the context of where they're living. They felt that I may understand them better. So, you know, without a shadow of a doubt, you know, these issues need to be taken very seriously, and I don't think the media understands them. And the media is obviously a big term to use, but I don't think the media understands enough about these issues, and it's definitely not training its staff or its journalists in relation to this. So just in the last few weeks, if we just look at some of the coverage in this country, in the UK, we've had the BBC documentary about Oscar Pistorius, which focused on him and not on the woman that he killed. We've had Peter Sutcliffe, a notorious serial killer of women, and the focus again was on him, not on the women that he killed. And then we've had the case of Johnny Depp, which went to the High Court in this country, as we know. And again, the witness to the domestic abuse that she suffered as his partner, another very famous Hollywood actress, Amber Heard. He's a famous Hollywood actor. She's a famous Hollywood actress. It's very unusual to have a similar level of power dynamics in a situation like this, but despite the power dynamics, despite her immense wealth, despite the fact that she has access to the best lawyers in the world and has access to vast quantities of journalists and all of that, she was still portrayed in the way that she was. And her entire sexual history and her relationship and marriage with this man was just out there for everyone, for her to be pored over and examined. And that just tells you what little, if any, power women have. If you've got a Hollywood actress with all that power and all that agency, she's not your average woman, so to speak, and still she was treated the way she was. And then we also had the case of Claire Parry, a woman who was killed at the hands of a man that she was in a relationship who happened to be a police officer. So all of these cases have come up in the last few weeks, so just in the last month or so. And overwhelmingly, as I said, I feel that the voices of the perpetrators are the ones that the media highlights, rather than the women that these men chose to kill or chose to hurt or chose to harm. And this doesn't happen by accident. A lot of this is because of the nature of violence against women and girls, which is always shown as being a kind of one-off incident. It's about something that happened to one woman. It's about a story of one woman, rather than a pattern, rather than a system of oppression, patriarchy, which allows this level of violence to be normalized. And this is very similar to racism. When we talk about racism in this country, which isn't very often, it's a forced conversation, okay? Racism is about anecdotal, one-on-one stories. You know, this man did this to this woman, that happened to that man over there across the road. It's never covered in terms of, a system. And how oppression manifests day to day. So that's the first thing. In terms of the coverage around the lockdowns and domestic abuse, again, whenever I've seen a lot of coverage in the last months, there is no context. We're not given the full story of how prevalent violence against women is day to day, how the criminal justice system is overwhelmingly failing women, etc., etc. These stories are always covered in silos as issues. They're never covered as part of a wider analysis of the situation. And this is the reason why we get the kind of coverage that we do. I feel very strongly that what we need to see in newsrooms, and I know Janie's been doing outstanding work along with colleagues, and you're going to talk about this more, so I'm just going to mention this very briefly, but we definitely need to see journalists being trained to conduct interviews with survivors of domestic abuse. You should never just be allowed to go and start questioning someone, having a small kind of understanding of what their so-called story is, because it's not just their story, it's their life, and it's about the trauma that they have, that they are going through, and that perhaps they will never recover from. So it's quite incredible that you can just wade into a situation like that and just start asking very personal questions, and questions that could quite frankly trigger further harm and put that person at further risk. Then I'm going to wrap up on this point, and that is that when the victims, as they overwhelmingly are portrayed in the media, they're very rarely called survivors, and when women do die at the hands of perpetrators as well, if you happen to be a woman of color, a black woman, you know, a visible Muslim woman, for example, the level of kind of normalization of that violence, it becomes an issue of culture, you know. So an honor, so-called honor killing, and the reason why I call it so-called is because obviously there is no honor in killing anyone, especially a woman, right? But these terms and this terminology takes over the story, rather than the fact that this woman who had a life, who was alive until a man chose to take her life away from her. And so you have these additional layers of misogyny and racism that kick in. And if you look at what's happening right now in this country, there's a case of Shamima Begum, her case is back in court. And again, the whole story and the framing around Shamima Begum, who has been a victim of grooming, who is a victim of sexual exploitation, and who we don't know what she's responsible for, because she's not been taken to a court where the evidence has not been presented. We have no idea if she was involved in exploiting women and girls. There's a very strong chance that she was, and there's a small chance that she wasn't. But what we do know is that she was groomed in London. She's exploited by a terrorist entity that treat women and girls like fodder, and she ended up in a foreign country, and she, to all intents and purposes, herself potentially has been sexually exploited, okay? But the coverage of her is all about how she's a monster, she's an unpalatable survivor of abuse and potentially a perpetrator as well. But the whole framing of her is done through the lens of otherness, through the lens of her headscarf, her hijab, her Muslimness, her deviance, right? And this does seep into coverage around women who are not white. And then we have the case of Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman, a devastating case of two young black women, two sisters who were killed in London. And not only is that horrifying, full stop, but then we also have learnt about the police, the Metropolitan Police. Number of officers have been suspended because they were taking photographs of these dead women and circulating them on WhatsApp. I mean, it's just really inconceivable. And we know throughout history that black women and our bodies, and women of colour's bodies, have been treated in a particular way, and in a very sexualized way, regardless of if you are sexual or not. That's kind of like the overwhelming tone that is used when it comes to these types of stories. So we have to be really aware of the fact that not all survivors and victims are treated equally. If you come from a place with intersecting identities, you are going to be treated in a very different way. You are not. So Shamima Begum is not allowed to be a victim of the crimes that have been committed against her. She should be held accountable for any crimes that she's perpetrated against anyone, particularly women and girls, okay? But we should also be allowed to see the exploitation that she has suffered herself as a young woman, as a young girl, I should say, now a woman, right? But this is all erased when it comes to coverage of these issues. So I'm going to stop there, but all I'm going to say is, as a concluding point, is the conversation that we're having this afternoon is essential, and these conversations need to happen in newsrooms across our country. And I know, again, Janie has been heavily involved in making sure these conversations take place, as have other colleagues, including David as well. So I think this is a starting point for a conversation that needs to continue, but we urgently need to see some action on this, because victims and survivors and people who don't know if they're going to ever be believed watch this coverage, they listen to this coverage, and they read this coverage, and quite frankly it puts them off from coming forward, because they don't want their lives poured over in the way that large sections of our media decide to treat people who have been victimized and abused in this way. That is a devastating reality.
Thank you, Shyster. And I mean, that so much of what you've said is a really, really strong wake-up call. So thank you so much. And I think that leads very well into David being able to take the floor, as it were. You and your family have been treated pretty shambolically in many ways, David, by the media. What can you share with us in terms of good practice, I suppose, in inverted commas, and bad practice, and you know, can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing to try to help centralize the situation for survivors and relatives, please?
Sure. So I guess mine is it's a bit more interesting because in terms of a context, it was really about 8 years. So well, about 9 years ago, my mother killed my father, and then 8 years later, we won an appeal which recognised the coercive control that she suffered that led to a loss of control. And initially, straight from the off, it was traumatising. You know, court reporting is a big issue. And it's a big talking point because obviously you've got a factual report, and what people say in court, anyone can say anything. You can perpetuate abuse as much as you want in court. It's that editorial responsibility of what's right and what's right to lead with it. In one of our earlier headlines, I think jealous mother wasn't even put in quotes. It was just literally the term that they went with, or jealous wife. And then I think the day of the appeal, it was hammer killer wife. And there's a sensationalizing narrative to victim stories, of which are, you know, cannon fodder for the press, invites intrigue and invites more interest, almost playing to the true crime narrative and as much to what Shaista was saying earlier with the Pistorius documentary. I think there's a lot of kickback against that, not because it's not really serving any purpose that wanted to touch on. It's not something. It's not a new appeal. My mother had a similar documentary. You could argue she was a murderer at the time, and then an appeal granted her manslaughter. But really, that had a prevalence in society in recognising abuse, and an appeal that would happen in an ongoing case. Pistorius' case, there's no new evidence. It's basically platforming a murder of a 4-part series with a victim whose voice completely minimised. And I think that's the real point of what we're talking about here, is giving survivors not that control, but that real belief that they're being listened to and treated carefully. You know, it's not another story. I realise journalists have horrific deadlines and they go to the next story, but there should be a stop moment before walking in that door to speak to a domestic abuse victim. My own personal experiences is I basically ran the media campaign myself and didn't trust anyone else. And so it was just all built on blind trust. One broadsheet, one tabloid came to us and we didn't want to speak to them. And then the editor said supposedly they were going to run the story, so it was in our best interest to speak to them. And immediately it's just, I have to speak to them and just live and pray and hope that they don't turn the story absolutely on its head. And it's really scary for any victim to, you know, a lot of victims, they do want to share their story if it can do good hope and help put a positive message out. But there's just not that control there. You know, the most I would get is a quote readback or factual feedback readbacks. And I think that just can't happen with domestic abuse victims. You're asking them to share some of the most personal things, and whatever they share can be changed. And you can have a great relationship with that reporter, and then the headline is just horrific. And I've had instances like that as well. So there's little to no control. And if you look at that in comparison to sexual assault victims in the UK, there's anonymity. And it's something that I've advocated for as a safeguard, but idealistically, we don't want to be shutting down stories of domestic abuse. They're really important, and they should be shared on the same narrative or the same way that a victim wants to share it, of course, because these narratives really instigate more trauma. You know, the trauma of the headlines 8 years ago that I had to experience, I then had to revisit again 9 years later with people kind of, trying to get it pulled from on Twitter and things like that. And it's the blackmail, or it's not almost a blackmail, it's the pressuring, and it goes across the media, not just news outlets, print and online, but in terms of TV broadcast, I've had absolute guilt tripping via TV producers. I could definitely tell there's a Jeremy Kyle effect kind of kicking on with victims and how they're used and rolled out onto the platform, and then there's no support. And I think there needs to really be that different set of guidelines when you approach domestic abuse victims, because you're instigating trauma. And I've written a few articles this year on it, and I've had the chance to speak to more victims related to anonymity campaigns in the UK, and what it does to them in seeing these articles live online in perpetuity forever. And realistically in this country, unless you are the victim, the person of the story, you cannot you have to be the one to make the complaint. So you've got to get right down that well, find that energy to then go tackle each individual news outlet. And I've done that personally, and it's absolutely tiring. And I can tell you, if it wasn't for me probably just pulling out the emotional strings, of which are very real, to get someone on the other side to recognise the sensationalism behind it. It's so important, because as much as about freeing my mother was not just freeing my mother because she's my mother, but it was about recognising what had happened, not perpetuating myths about women who killed, who are jealous, and really recognising male violence. And certainly, as we'll talk about this year with COVID, early on the first lockdown in the UK in April, coronavirus murder. I mean, that's not a thing. It's, it's, as we're going to talk about, coronavirus has really made it a lot tougher, but it's shining a light on what these issues were already there before. It's really shone a big spotlight. And I think media have done a good job in trying to keep it up there, but it's really that editorial control over narratives. And the biggest ones I've struggled with is court reporting. Anything you say in court, the kickback. I think the Claire Parry one was plotted lover's downfall on the BBC News, and everyone kicked off about that. And on the Newswatch programme on BBC, where the editors review complaints, literally their feedback was, this is what was said in court. And so, I mean, in our case, we heard, in my mother's case, you can't have depression if you're working your job to a high complex standard. And that's the biggest myth of depression. You can operate technical, heavy machinery with depression. So anything you say in court can be used. And that's the scary thing about it. I think it's acknowledging you can print that to an extent. Of course, it's factual reporting, but to lead and open with a headline with that, you are completely framing it. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we have to get past, and having a set of guidelines to give us the tools to do that is really so critical. Otherwise, there's a lot of victims out there who are helpless, and we're trying to, obviously, Janie's trying to really get people's experiences in, because not a lot of research is done like this before, and the effects of this reporting on victims, who visits them 5-10 years down the line, where all they can remember are the news reports. I think, first time I saw the murder weapon was on headline TV news. No one prepares you for this, as much as obviously the police's media departments need to have a good relationship, the family liaison officers, with the media departments and what's coming out.
Thank you, David. And I'm very struck by what you've said, but particularly I know that I imagine it must be tiring talking about this experience. So I'm very grateful to you for sharing it. I did just want to ask you one follow-up question. You're doing a piece of work to support others, other family members, other survivors, other victims as well, about your way forward piece of work. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, it's not a piece of work I'm doing. I think it's just a consistent campaigning effort. And I spotted the amazing work Janie's been doing on this, and developing fatal domestic abuse guidelines, which I'm sure she'll talk about. I think it's really just embodying and cementing that within the Editor's Code, which is a code in this country which is a bit more enforceable. Or it's, instead of a set of guidelines, it's a bit more, you're held more accountable for it, because you really have to. There's so many freelance journalists as well, not just newsroom journalists, But it's really delivering that culture of, look, before you engage with a victim of domestic abuse, you should be giving them a resource. In my personal opinion, that should be a central source of information for instances like this, for survivors who want to share their stories and can be that support, whether that's with a big national charity or a specialist group, which I think might be best. It's just important. Otherwise, you're sitting there and you're believing someone who's nice as pie to your face, which has happened here in this very room. And they say, well, the editor said they're going to run the story, so it's probably in your best interest to speak. And I think as long as they have that extra resource and they give that card over, they can then call that person, get some advice, and that's the relationship. This should be a collaborative relationship between survivors and journalists. It's a symbiotic thing. Journalists want to cover this and raise the awareness, and victims want to share, and we all want to come out of it with the way that we all saw it and felt.
Great. Well, thank you. And so that leads us well on to Janey, who's been doing some really amazing work with newsrooms, and I particularly want you to, if you can, address this idea of there's a kind of disjunct, isn't there, between the reporters who are reporting the stories and then potentially the people who are using the inverted commas clickbait headlines, and how do we kind of manage to bridge that gap is one thing, and then what from your perspective has been working and what hasn't been working. So over to you, Janey.
Thank you, and thank you for creating this space. I have so much to say, just in response to what everyone said. So what I want to start with is the fact that domestic abuse is systemic, right? 2 women a week are murdered by a partner or ex-partner. This is a standing item in all of our newspapers. And it still astounds me that journalists don't see this as something they need to report on or train themselves up on to respond sensitively to. So I think what's really important to me, in general, I'm a domestic abuse campaigner, and I believe in a vision of society where everybody sees a role for themselves in ending domestic abuse. We have to. It's a public health concern. Oisika, I love the terminology that you use, that it's the shadow pandemic. I agree. And I think this has preceded the COVID-19 pandemic for decades. So I think what I really want to say is that journalists have power and influence. Whether they like it or not, they do. It's about how they use it. And I genuinely believe that if journalists can report domestic abuse, fatal domestic abuse more sensitively, we can stop more women dying. That's why Level Up created the guidelines they're called Dignity of Dead Women, and they're about how to report fatal domestic abuse. It's a tool to support journalists at any stage of the court process, from the immediate aftermath, where it's a breaking news story, to once there's been a conviction, and years later down the line when you can do a long form feature with the family members. It supports journalists on what they need to know and how to approach things, what to do, what to not do, and I'll cover some of those points shortly. But what I really want to reiterate is just the fact that domestic abuse is about power and control. And what's really, really, really sad is that, David and I have been working on a piece of research with bereaved families, and it's going to be published shortly. What was really striking from the evidence from that was that the vast majority of families do want to speak to the press about what's happened. They want the truth to be out there. They don't want it to happen to other people. They want to save more lives. But then two out of 3 families that we spoke to said that their grieving process was damaged by the press. Some of them have been really re-traumatized by the way the press have treated them, whether that's from doorstepping to publishing photos of the murder weapon, to trawling, a dead sister's Facebook account to find a picture of herself in a bikini on a beach, because that's the photo that the journalist thought was appropriate. Shyster, I really want to speak to your point about how women are sexualized across the press regardless, and I think it just feels really, really, really upsetting when that continues after their death, when there is no dignity in it whatsoever. So I think what's important for journalists to recognize, and particularly for Ipso, is there was a clause amendment to the editor's code for suicide in 2005, because journalists and Ipso recognise that suicide is a public health issue and journalists should respond because they have a duty to speak to public health. I would argue the same for fatal domestic abuse. we live in a country where 2 women a week are murdered. I don't know if that's not a public health concern. I don't know what is.
Janie, just sorry to interrupt you. Just for those people who don't
Yes.
come from the UK, could you just explain what Ipso is, just very briefly?
Yes, of course. Okay, so Ipso is the Independent Press Standards Organisation. So that's the press regulator, and they've created a code for journalists to follow when they're training, just to, you know, there's very basic principles in it around accuracy and just making sure that the way that you approach your writing and your reporting is ethical. And I think what I'm arguing for, and I think David is too, I think all of us in this space would, is that code needs to reflect that fatal domestic abuse is a public health concern and should be reported on very sensitively, and there should be training on it. So I just want to quickly cover like the parts of the guidelines if people aren't aware of them. What we ask for are very basic things. So we ask for, you know, be accurate in your reporting, stick to the facts, even if there are few. That means that if somebody has been charged for a murder of a partner and a child, write those very things, you know, don't speculate. Don't use words like horror, tragedy, bloodbath, you know, just stick to the facts, because what you need to remember is your article may be just one article for you, it's one story amidst many for that day's work, but actually it's a living online memorial for the victim, and her children and her family members will read it again and again for years to come. You know, it's not, you know, it's not tomorrow's chip paper. Tomorrow's chip paper is all over Google for eternity, and that's incredibly traumatic when the reporting is so insensitive. So secondly, we need to hold perpetrators accountable. We need to name the crime as domestic abuse when we're able to, when there's been a conviction. Put the relevant helplines, put the resources there for anyone who might be recognizing the fact that their partner might have threatened to kill them. They may feel unsafe in their relationship. They may have recognized some of the behaviors reported on, and they need help, and journalists have a key role in signposting them to that help. You know, and the last point I want to draw in is just dignity. Send to the victim what we know of her, what was incredible about her, the service she gave to her community, what her family members have to say about her. I think what's really sad is that so often just these very, very basic things are missed. And actually what we see is very, you know, textbook headlines where it's like, man killed wife after her actions, almost explicitly her actions. There are ridiculous quotes in tabloids. The headlines are so irresponsible. And actually, the fact of the matter is, domestic abuse is about power and control, and it's about the fact that a perpetrator kills to assert the ultimate power over someone, which is to take their life. There's no other way of describing it.
Thank you so much, Janie. I mean, while you're on the power and control idea, would you just set out some of your thoughts around COVID and you know, you wrote a piece for us for the Ethical Journalism Network a while ago about how this rise in domestic violence was about control and it wasn't about COVID. And just while you're kind of formulating your thoughts around that, if people do have questions, please put them in the chat function. You can address them to me. I will pass them through to the panelists as well. We've got about 20 more minutes, but Janie, over to you again.
So I think this comes back to the issue of accountability, right? It's, you know, someone has chosen to kill someone else. They should be held accountable for their decision. And Professor Jane Monckton-Smith has done fantastic research on this. She's produced a piece of research called the Homicide Timeline, where she studied over 400 cases of fatal domestic abuse and mapped all of the parallels in the cases. And what she found is that there are 8 predictable stages from the beginning of a relationship to a fatality. And actually, what she argues, and I really support her claims, is the fact that what's happened is the pandemic has raised the risk level. So what she would say is, from going from a level 4 to a level 5 on the homicide timeline, that's effectively what's happened. And that's a loss of control in the perpetrator, whether that's external circumstances. It's that sense of control that they want to reassert over the victim's life. And furthermore, I think a really, really notable statistic that I would like everyone to remember after today is that 49% of domestic homicides happen within a month of separation. And I think that speaks to the truth beneath all fatal domestic abuse incidents. Is just the fact that the perpetrator cannot stand a victim having a life outside of them, and they cannot stand it to the extent that they will take that person's life. And I think what's most important is the press are not complicit in the perpetrator's narrative of events, because the victim is no longer there. And actually, what's really, really important is that journalists remember their accuracy, remember they shouldn't be biased, and remember to wait for all of the facts and try to build a bigger picture of the relationship, because these incidents don't come out of the blue.
Thank you, Janie, so much. Shaista, you had a comment you wanted to make.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the back of what Janie said. So yeah, so you know, David, you said this as well about the COVID situation and lockdown. The context that's missing is that for women who are subjected to domestic abuse, lockdown never ends for them. Lockdown never ended for them way before we had a lockdown, because their home is not safe. They are trapped inside their homes because that's where the perpetrator has the ultimate power, as Janie said very clearly, but that context is never given. So when we hear about these stories about lockdown and the increase in reporting of domestic abuse, as we know that the National Domestic Abuse Helpline received 40,000 calls during the first lockdown. Incredible, right? But we are not overwhelmingly given the rest of the context and the information that one of the place that's most unsafe for women who are being subjected to domestic abuse is their home. As women, society conditions us to look over our backs when we're walking through dark alleyways, and you know, something horrific could happen to us by people who are unknown to us. Overwhelmingly, women are harmed and killed by people they know, by men they're in a relationships or who they've been married to or they have a connection with. It's not by random strangers. Of course that happens, but as I said, as women, overwhelmingly this is the kind of information that's given to us, and this is how we're conditioned. But this side of the story has been missing, and it continues to be missing in the coverage around COVID-19 and the impact that it's having on women and their ability to stay alive.
Thank you, Shaista. Thank you. That's a really great point. Oisika, I want to bring you back in if that's okay, because we've been speaking quite specifically, I guess, about the UK context, but is there anything that we've spoken about here that you want to kind of pick up on, Oisika?
Absolutely. No, thank you. This is such a needed conversation. You know, I think just generally, and speaking to Shaista's point and also Jane, the thing is that I think women are not heard, seen, or talked about in the media or quoted just generally in the ecosystem that exists. You know, UN Women supports the Global Media Monitoring Project that has been coming out every 5 years since 1995. And the fifth edition, which was 2015, actually said it was only 24% in the news headlines that you read or on the front page of stories that you read are really quoting women, are about women, and the same with television. They are doing their the latest study, and they had to postpone some of it because of COVID, but they do this global monitoring, I think, across 141 countries across the world. And Chinese newspapers, website that they did a sort of a trial run on, Austrian newspapers, websites, social media, even though we all know that the violence against women has been surging because of many, many reasons during the lockdown, we're still not seeing them in the headlines. So, you know, the environment in which news functions as such is not one that supports the voices of women and girls across the world. And I think capacity building, as Shaista was saying, she worked for the BBC. I used to work in my old days with one of the biggest news outlets in India, are not trained, and capacity building, I think, is a lot that needs to be done, and UN Women does quite a bit of that.
Thank you, Oisika. And I think you're right that it's a systemic issue, isn't it? You know, when we talk about everything we've spoken about today, you know, we need more context to it. We need to understand it's more of a systemic issue. I would just like to raise one point myself, Oisika, maybe you can respond to this. When we heard before from Shyster about the fact that the most dangerous place for women is at home, I remember doing some training several years ago in Georgia, in the Caucasus, for UN Women, and it was around gender sensitive reporting. And a lot of the pushback I got from journalists was the fact that, well, it's none of our business. If it takes place in people's homes, this is none of our business. And in a society which is very patriarchal, that is kind of one of the baseline beliefs. How do you, Oisika, what would your message be, Oisika, to journalists in that situation in terms of helping them understand that actually it is their responsibility?
I think, I think the bottom line is if a crime has been committed, and in most countries across the world, there is legislation. It's not as if legislation doesn't exist. Legislation has to be implemented with funding, with resources, with the police system, with the justice system. But I think it's a job of a journalist to report on the fact that when domestic abuse happens or domestic violence happens, you know, even for FGM that Shaista was talking about, in many countries across the world, it is not legal. this is illegal. The same way we say that, sometimes, one puts it down on religion, but no religion is prescribing the beating up of women. I mean, it's the interpretation that is often what is negating the fact that a crime has been committed. And I think it's the job of a journalist to have that accuracy, to be able to report, without prejudice, without bias, without harming, without, retribution that often the survivors and victims of violence face. It is the job of a journalist. And, many of us here are from that industry, but also for that little child reading that story, for that survivor of violence who is sitting inside a home before lockdown, during lockdown, and looking for some way out. I think it is the journalists that can change their whole lives. And I think that's a huge responsibility to carry, but a huge influence that they have. And I think it's important to remember that.
Thank you. And actually, that's quite an inspiring thing in some ways, right? We have this incredible responsibility, but also it's a really important job that we can do if we do it well. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I'd like to just raise this to you, David, but allow you to think about it while somebody's answering the next question. So to David, in a moment. Hi, this is Rabia Mushtaq. She's asking the question to everybody, but I'd like you to address it, David. She says, while I've done stories on gender as part of my work, I haven't specifically reported on domestic violence. If I am to do stories on domestic violence or abuse, what is the most appropriate way to approach a victim/survivor? How is one supposed to frame their questions in order to not appear insensitive while interviewing them and reporting their experience later on? I'll allow you to think about that for a few minutes. I just want to come back to Janey, if that's okay. Question from Margaret, and I think I saw Sheister's hand up as well previously, but a question from Margaret Hughes, who's head of the Association for Journalism Educators. How is the news media responding, Janey, to the guidelines written by Level Up? And is there a recognition that the reporting of domestic abuse is an issue? Janey.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think one of the most heartwarming experiences about creating the guidelines was that I had a lot of conversations with journalists in the preparation. It wasn't that I was coming in and telling people righteously how to do their job, because I'm not a journalist. I don't know the pressures that you face. I don't know why these stories come about in the way that they do. And I was very curious in speaking to both families who'd been bereaved by homicide and journalists, what was going wrong. And what was incredible in that journey towards building the guidelines were there were so many journalists across the political spectrum, across all genders, saying, thank you so much for doing this. We desperately need this. This is so needed. And what was incredible there is that actually, because so many journalists contributed to the formation of the guidelines, when they were published, there were so many people spreading them around. I've trained journalists in the Independent, at the Sun. It doesn't hold to any particular political allegiance. It's just something that so many people recognize needs to shift. And that's been really helpful. But what I will say is that, the trainings are so needed, and repeatedly so, because actually the churn, because of the state of the journalism sector, is so high. There are so many freelancers. There's so much, I think actually what would be great to talk to you about later on actually is in the training of journalists when they're graduating, what we can do there. That's probably one of the most key interventions that we can make.
Let me move to David, and then I think we will come back to that question, because actually the point is, this conversation has to start early on in people's careers, right? So David, the question I just asked from Rabia about how is one supposed to frame their questions, what's the most appropriate way to interview, over to you, David.
I think what I learned early on was people I would just expect them to know everything, and then I would just answer their questions almost, monosyllabically, or have whatever their question was. And then I started to learn that, they don't know the whole picture. So I think it's really important to approach them with, obviously knowing about their story and wanting to work together, to collaborate, to create something that's worthwhile, and just make the time to listen to them. Don't come in with preconceptions, listen to their story, because it's as much about hearing the context of it and their trauma for resharing it. There's that trust that you understand what that means to them. That's not just like A, B, C, D, oh, there's that occurred, and they're just patching it together. It's something that you're working on together. And I think very much, as I was speaking earlier, I think really this habit of just having quote readbacks and just factual readbacks, it's just absolutely terrifying. I can't tell you how terrifying it is if you don't know a journalist, even if you do know the journalist, how that might appear on page, and giving them the full expectation of what will appear, because very often people do give their stories over and sometimes it just doesn't make it, whether that's a news bulletin or it just gets shafted. I think I saw that happen last year with a national news segment, and it really caused a lot of trauma, and they reached out to me and they realised their misstep. I think it's just taking those careful, considered steps and letting that person breathe, tell their story, work together to give their expectations and what those will be, and give them the full scope of what that story will look like, so that they're not just worrying about it. Because until you see it online, on print, you're just worrying that your story, you're both on the same page, you know? And I think that's the way. Only compassion leads these things, and compassion is able to and understand that, and speaking to enough victims, you will learn to understand that. But coming in hot, I think that's the best way to kind of approach it.
David, thank you so much. I'm very struck by both what you and Janie have both said about this idea of, you know, for journalists this may just be a story, but for you this is a life, and this is so much more than that. It's a living, as you say, the phrase a living online memorial that you mentioned, Janie, that's a really striking example of the importance of getting this right as journalists. Shaista, you've got a comment to make. We've probably only got 5 to 10 minutes left at the moment. Shaista, do you want to make a comment? And then I'd like to go back to you, Janie, on the academic importance of training journalists early. And then somebody else has got another question coming through, which I will just then also get you all to kind of summarise, if that's okay. So Shaista, go ahead.
Thanks, Hannah. I'll keep this short. So just to follow on from your point, David, I mean, as Janie's already said, stories now stay online, as we know. There's a lifespan for these stories. So I think newsrooms and journalists have also an added responsibility, not just in terms of everything we've discussed, but when you're going to cover these stories, you have a responsibility to the individuals who you're talking to ensure that they have the support they need when they get trolled online, when you know, they are being hounded by individuals, often very organised groups of people coming after them. And there is a responsibility on documentary makers, on journalists, to sit down with people and explain that this is very likely to happen, and you need to know that this is what you can do to gain support, to gain help, and how you can address some of it. And that's not happening, and it needs to happen.
Thank you, Shaista. I would all point you towards, there's a book written by a colleague of mine, a friend of mine now actually, she's called Jo Healy. She's written a book called Trauma Reporting, and it's about the relationship, the importance of the relationship between the journalist and the people who have been bereaved and impacted by trauma as well. She's doing some training for various news organisations, but it's JO and then HELEY, I think, but Trauma Reporting it's called. So thank you for that. For those who have got to leave at the moment, just a quick point from Mags. Not a question, but need to say this, and this is a really great point, Mags. Thank you. Intimate partner violence of older women is often referred to as elder abuse and portrayed more as hate crime by the media than for what it is. It is domestic abuse. Portraying it as anything else erases the gendered nature of the abuse and is in effect ageist in its representation. So thank you, Mags, for that comment. Janie, to the need to embed this in academic conversations as well, and then I'll ask you all for your kind of final thoughts on this in terms of next steps. So Janie.
I think it just needs to come from all angles. I think what we need is just a holistic approach where journalists are being trained on it before they graduate and before they go to work. I think we need the press regulators to come in and say what's okay and what's not okay. I think what was ridiculous to me when I went to meet the press regulators with Ryan Hart, they said, we don't have any complaints about fatal domestic abuse. And Jane Monckton-Smith, who was with me, was like, you don't have any complaints because the victim's dead. And I think what was so ridiculous was the fact that their complaints framework is set up in a way that means that unless you're the person in the article, you can't complain. which is just rigged for failure. And that's when our white Level Up is gathering its own evidence to present to the regulator to say, no, you're completely failing, and actually journalists are intruding onto people's grief and shock, and you need to be accountable for this. Whether you gather the evidence or not, this is the evidence, this is the reality, and we're going to be looking at it. And then finally, the public have a huge role in how, you know, responding to journalists, making good use of Twitter. I think Twitter can be a really harmful platform in a lot of ways, but I do think a lot of journalists spend time on Twitter and they do respond. And actually, you know, I've emailed journalists directly, and I think a point that I think David, you made, Shyster or David, you made it. It's really good that journalists are reporting about fatal domestic abuse. It's really important that they're writing about this. And I always make a point when I complain to a journalist to say, thank you so much for writing this. It's really important we talk about these stories. Could you consider changing this? And I think the public have a huge role in responding, complaining, and making that feedback. So editors start to think, oh God, this is a headache. We need to get this right. We need to get training on this.
That's a great point. That's this idea of kind of saying thank you to people. It's really important, acknowledging the importance of it, and then perhaps, you know, saying to them, but could you do this in a slightly different way next time? I think that's a really good, important point. Thank you, Janie. Shyster,
and people respond to it.
That's good. I mean, that's good to know. So yeah, thank you. Shyster, I'll ask for your final thoughts, and then I'll go to Oisika, and then David, I'll give you the last word if that's okay.
Yeah, so obviously from this discussion, we know there's a lot of work that needs to continue to happen. I agree with what Janie's saying. We do need to praise those journalists who are doing the work properly, and because it encourages others to do the same. But the main thing we need to tackle is the so-called normalization of the daily violence against women and girls, which is part and parcel of every society around the world. Patriarchy is alive and well and thriving, and it needs to be challenged at every level.
That's great. Thank you, Shaista. And Oisika, I'm assuming that dovetails quite nicely into what you might say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thanks again, Hannah, for this space. I would urge the listeners as well as others to, if you want to, please have a look at our UN Women's website, where we have done a hand over the mic. And you can really see what's happening across the world, whether it's in terms of folks who respond to the violence against women, from essential workers to counselors as well as survivors themselves. But I think, I mean, based on the conversation we have had, one thing I think is clear, that these stories are in the headlines, and I think it is we all can play a role to make sure that they stay in the headlines. That violence against women is 1 in 3. Before the lockdown, 1 in 3 women will be impacted by violence. So I think all of us have a role to play in trying to come to an end to this pandemic. And journalists and media have a huge role to play, whether it's that woman looking at the story and trying to get out of a situation, or whether it is to move the police, move the judiciary, and so many others. So thanks so much for giving the space to have this conversation.
Thank you. And actually, I just pick up on the fact that it needs to stay in the headlines, but stay in the headlines in the right, responsible, ethical way as well. David, I'm going to give you the last word, and then I will just come back and say thank you to everybody, if that's okay.
Sure. I think, I've lived, twice going through the media, and it's been as traumatizing as the next. And sharing your stories is really, really scary. Like we've all been saying, it lives in perpetuity online. And, I've had absolute fits and worries about sharing our story with the media and the effect that leaves, because we were deeply traumatized by the first round. And I was stubborn to not let it happen this time. But I think there's people that do get it right. There are great, I'll name one, Telegraph. They're really, national newspaper in the UK, they're really great at women's issues. You can have really great departments, and there's really good networks of journalists online who use survivors as a resource. So even if you don't know how to approach a survivor, if you're worried and someone that might be a bit more amenable or have a similar experience, there is a way that we can all work together to have a story that gives them, from a sense of an absolute loss of a situation, a loss of a loved one, or a loss of what they've been through, that they can get something out of it that will leave an imprint that, it wasn't all for nothing. It can help someone in the future. And that was very much our campaign. And I hope it will be for anyone that wishes to share their story in the future.
David, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, to Oisika, to Janie, to Shaista, to David, for all of those who have joined us on this panel discussion. It's been a wide-ranging and I think really informative and interesting panel discussion. It's just part of the conversation. If people want to get in touch with our panelists, their Twitter handles have all been tweeted out. I'm sure they will be able to respond in that manner. This has been recorded. This panel, it will be on YouTube. If you need to get in contact with me about specific stuff, please don't hesitate. And once again, thank you to all your panelists for sharing your fantastic insights and giving of your time. Thank you then. Bye-bye.